Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Vlog and Podcast. So we do this vlog and podcast every Sunday at 8 a.m. London time, and it's really just a wrap up from of the news from Zimmer Peacock for this week. So one of the things that we've done, um, I think at the end of 2022 and certainly going into 2023, we've definitely done a lot more workshops. You do realize that in order for people to really understand sometimes the science and the technology that we're sort of centric around at ZP, you really need to get people face to face. And so we have these workshops, people come in, they if it's the biosensor workshop, we do 1 day versions, we do 2 day versions, and they're really impactful. I mean, we put a lot of images out of attendees at these workshops, and people have a really I think you know not just enjoyable, but actually they are learning a lot as well, and we're also learning a lot. So we like this reciprocation of workshops, seeing people, hearing their questions, answering their questions. It all works really well for us. So we're expanding that workshop now, and we're starting to expand it into our FoodSense technology range. So FoodSense is a technology which primarily today people use it for measuring the Scoville heat units, the SHU. And even that term SHU, Scoville heat units, it's it's such an unusual term. It was kind of invented by, I think it was Wilbur Scoville, who was diluting chili products until you could no longer taste them. And I think that each dilution was not think I know each dilution was 10x. So it's extremely unusual um, food panel testing where you'd get a range of people. They would by diluting the product by 10x each time until the panel could no longer taste it. So it was subjective in the fact that there were individuals doing the scoring, but it was objective in the fact that he actually had quite a few people, in the panel, let's say. So trying to make it statistically significant. Um, Now, coming back to the workshop, so just that term Scoville heat unit has so much sort of information loaded up inside it that you really have to kind of explain that. Now, of recent times, there's been more of a sort of transition over to HPLC. There's a method called the AOAC method 995.03. And this is an HPLC method for determining Scoville heat units. But of course, there's a big difference between a panel test and an HPLC system. So when some of us, sort of think about this a little bit, that people's perception of taste is very hard to quantify by a analytical HPLC system, but that's more reproducible, more objective rather than subjective. And then there's the food sense from Zimmer and Peacock, which is really a Scoville heat unit meter. And we can also directly measure the capsaicin as well. And from that, we can also determine the Scoville heat unit. Now, when you become involved in such industries and activities, you do understand that people come with different backgrounds. And so sometimes we have to have a discussion about accuracy. Sometimes we have to discussion about precision. Sometimes we have to talk about things like limit of detection. And we have to talk about, people will receive what's called a certificate of analysis that will come from an HPLC system. So what will happen is I will have a chili powder. I will send it to my local analytical lab. They will analyze it, and then I will get a number back. Now, what's happening is they're getting these numbers back, but there are no description necessarily of the HPLC system, no description of the calibration routine that was used, no error associated with the number. So people take these numbers as absolute values when really they're at best, maybe absolute, but with an error. And that error could actually be quite significant. Um, and so people hold these sort of certificates of analysis. In particular, I'm talking here about the HPLC analysis of capsaicin, and they take these certificates and these numbers as the truth. And then obviously they have things like the food sense, and they want to understand, why there's a difference. Now, sometimes these differences are something like um, somebody will measure a product at 110,000 Scoville heat units. They may measure it on the food sense at 98,000 Scoville heat units. The error there is about 12%. And so you have to explain that 12% is really not that significant. Anyway, to help with people's understanding of both the fundamental of what Scoville heat unit is, the analytical methods and how we've got to the food sense, and then also the sort of statistics and maths behind measuring numbers in the food industry. We are doing a workshop around that. So that workshop will be online and also be in person. The first workshop will be on the 8th of March, 2023, but we're quite happy to hold it, every month and try and add some value to the community, let's say. So I suppose that's really in a similar vein that we have done some webinars recently on measuring the accuracy and precision when doing measurements. I know this for many of you who listen to this, accuracy and precision are, definitely well understood. And I remember first doing this as it was about the first semester when I was doing my PhD. I thought what a revelation it was at the time. I'm really bit daft. I should have known about this earlier on, but I learned it and I've held it with myself ever since. The understanding that in life, when you have a new method, you can sometimes get precision, but when there's like a reference method out there, then you can move from precision to accuracy, and that's what we sort of tend to do. We go for precision first of all, and then accuracy. Sometimes accuracy is just an offset. That maybe the measurement that everyone sort of believes in, i.e. the truth, actually has an offset in it that nobody really appreciates. And so sometimes you have to adjust your measurement to understand that offset so that you can also be close to the true value. But what's interesting about science and analytical science is truth is really sometimes a really hard concept. I'm thinking about it and thinking, that there are universal standards out there, and people sort of get hold of these standards and measure against it. But things like capsaicin, there are no universal standards. So, the truth is not really that well, let's say, defined. Moving on a little bit, but really keeping to keeping in the ZP philosophy. We put a little video out there this week, which was really about microfluidics. So microfluidics is, at Zimmer and Peacock, we do a lot of measurement, a lot of analytical science, a lot of shrinking analytical science is down to point of need testing. That's really what we're doing. And in part of that, you have to have sometimes microfluidic devices, the ability to move a sample onto a sensor. And, when you start bringing in microfluidics, you then introduce the opportunity to move that sample in a repeatable, accurate manner. You also get the ability to reduce that sample size. And all we were saying really in a sort of video and a little note that we put out this week is just keep it simple. Now, what I mean by that is there's a term out there, lab on a chip. Now, lab on a chip would suggest that you take your lab procedure. Your lab procedure could be take a sample, dilute a sample, centrifuge a sample, filter a sample, make a measurement on sample. That would be a lab, let's say, procedure, and it would give you a very accurate and precise result. To my further comments, my previous comments. The problem with that is reducing that to a microfluidic device can be end up with a very costly device. There's too many processes on there, lots of materials. One of the as I described that, then I thought, well, there's a dilution in there, there's a filter in there. The centrifugation would be really hard to achieve, so maybe that wouldn't be. But people do try to literally take the lab procedure and put it on a microfluidic, and they call it lab on a chip. And that term does lead people to really, let's say, sort of end up with a very expensive, hard to manufacture device. So at Zimmer and Peacock, let's keep it simple. We say keep the microfluidics simple, keep it simple, because otherwise you are going to not end up with a low cost in vitro diagnostic or a low cost test. You're going to end up with a very expensive test with reagents and materials on there that will end up just raising the cost to a point that actually you can't commercialize it. So if people are interested in that, just let us know, actually, because we can expand upon this topic a little bit more. Now, every Thursday at 8 a.m. London time, we do a webinar where we answer technical questions. So this week we talked about pH and oxygen sensing for bioprocessing. We talked about sodium and potassium sensors. We talked about chili measurement and literally electrochemistry being a fingerprinting technology for chili products. We talked about hydrogen peroxide sensing. We did talk about cyclovoltammetry at higher concentrations. That was an unusual one for us because it was one of the questions that came through the YouTube channel. But it was a good question. And what's really nice about that ZP, we put a lot of material into the public domain, but the questions come back really make us think about our science, our technology, our products, our services. So we really like that feedback. And that was a good question because the questioner was asking, cyclovoltammetry is a representation of diffusion limitation. If I keep on raising the concentration, will I then essentially, he was saying, will I break that diffusion limitation? And I was showing him that over several, or them rather, over several orders of concentration change, the shape of the cyclovoltammetry did not change. So that process of diffusion limitation did not change. But it was a good question, and I was able to show them how we could break that diffusion limitation by actually what's called doing forced mass transport, which is forced mass transport. If you stirred a solution, if you shook a solution, if you pumped a solution, all these sort of ways of moving liquid, they would actually change the shape of the cyclovoltammogram, and you become sort of forced mass transport limited. And I was appreciative of the person because they watched the webinar and actually they took that feedback in real time and were able to say, yeah, I get it now. But I thought it was a good question because it illustrates my point that which is actually you're always learning, and the more you ask or the more you listen to the questions and the statements from other people, really the more you actually learn yourself. So it was a good webinar this week, and we do always appreciate those questions. A, because we want to answer them, and B, in answering questions, you gain a new insight yourself. We also did put a little bit of a note out there this week. We do have a very, what we call a sort of super user at the University of Minnesota, where they've actually used the food sense and they actually compare it against HPLC. Now, this is a lab that's, I think by their own, well, not by their own admission, they did tell me directly that they obviously understand the limitations at the University of Minnesota about the HPLC determination of Scoville heat units. But they just want to see that we correlate with food sense against the HPLC method. And they're really good guys because actually they do these correlations and they're very sweet because they say, no, you guys have a good product in terms of what we're measuring on the HPLC. You're also measuring on the food sense. And then they go on to say, but you've got the advantage that actually you can do triplicate measurements, for example, on the food sense, whereas on the HPLC, we can't. We can't afford to do that. So we have a nice collaboration with the University of Minnesota. They have a really good researcher there, and it was never prompted by us. They just bought this system and they actually use it to educate the local growing community around them. So thank you to them for that. It's appreciated. The last thing here is we put a note out this week. Now, admittedly, it was in Norwegian, but we're talking about the H5N1, which is unfortunately this new avian flu or bird flu. It's an influenza virus, as I say, H5N1, and it unfortunately, sort of millions of birds around the world are dying. It's both wild birds, but like for example in the UK, there's a lot of chicken farms, and they're actually really suffering as well. So there's a high mortality, more morbidity among the chicken farms that, and they're concerned about this virus actually sort of jumping the barrier and coming into mammals. I believe, unfortunately, there are some incidents already, and more serious than that, there was. I think it was a little girl. Unfortunately, I want to say Cambodia, but there was a little girl in Asia that also has just died from the virus. Now, we're not going to be sending alarms because I think for all the sort of millions of exposures per day, probably to humans, this is just one incident. And with these things, you've got to be very careful because there can be other complicating factors. But it is for us at ZP, we know that we can sort of be part of the preparedness for this H5N1 virus, with kits and diagnostics. Um, it's just a personal thing. It's a little frustrating that actually, in order to have that happen, there really has to be a sort of government will, and we haven't at the moment been able to find that government will. And when I say government will, I don't mean necessarily local governments here, but I mean sort of across the globe. But anyway, we put a little note out there this week. It is something that we are interested in being part of preparedness. Um, we do, I really sincerely hope this is a low risk because I do believe that one incident um, really doesn't constitute um, a massive threat to humanity, but we do want to be cognizant of it, and we do want to be prepared for it. And we do have at ZP the technology for doing, um, let's say, rapid diagnostics, RTD. That just reminds me actually that we do these workshops, and we do talk about rapid diagnostic testing at these workshops. So I think if I wanted to summarize the week so far, so we will be holding workshops um, on the 8th of March, for example, around food sensing. In there, we will be talking about things like accuracy and precision. Um, that really sort of also is supported by that at ZP. We have put some work out this week about microfluidics, and I think microfluidics do really help in that understand of accuracy and precision in vitro diagnostics. We have our ZP Developer Zone. So if you have technical questions of Zimmer and Peacock, don't hesitate to reach out to us. There's a contact page on our website. I think that every technical question that comes in does get a response to in our weekly webinar. And as an example of that, we do talk about Scoville heat units versus, or HPLC versus food sense. That's something we covered. And then just something that we're starting to at least mentally prepare for is the idea that we might have to pivot to an H5N1 diagnostic technology. I think that's important just for actually the welfare of animals in the agricultural industry. But of course, we'd also want to have it available in case there was an issue that the virus hopped the species barrier and unfortunately came into humans. And like I said, there's one incident, but I don't want to be alarmist. You've got to be really careful about that. We don't know the entire scenario, complicating factors around that. So I wouldn't. We certainly are not unduly concerned about that. We just want to be prepared. So let me say thank you very much if you're following our vlog and podcast this week. We'll do the same next week. So it's every Sunday 8 a.m. London time. There's no need to watch or listen live because we do record it. But any technical questions, send them into ZP and we'll answer them every Thursday 8 a.m. London time in our ZP Developers Zone. So I want to say thank you very much and have a really good week. Okay, take care. Bye bye.